The GDP market. Wow. If the interest rate is lowered, it induces the people to spend more. Do you agree or disagree? And what are the incentives? What is being sacrificed and what alternatives are there? All right. So like before, record this slide number, write this statement, your opinion about it, and at least 2 points for each of the 3 questions that you see. There are 2 main evils in macroeconomics. One of them is unemployment, the other one is inflation, which is a sustained increase in the average level of prices, a persistent rise in the cost of living. So we don't like that, right? The way it's measured is by comparing the price of over 600 goods and services from year to year. So these are the things that households buy most. And notice that it's not just goods, it also includes services, which is also a main part of the cost of living. So that basket, the cost of that is called the Consumer Price Index, which was developed by Irving Fisher, an American economist. So the percent change of CPI would be inflation. So we have a simple formula, CPI2 minus CPI1 over CPI1 times 100. That's our inflation rate, okay? Sometimes you are going to see P instead of CPI is the same thing. So sometimes you see a formula which is shorter, P2 minus P1 or P1 times 100. It's the same thing, right? This is a simple formula that's called percent change or growth rate, and you've seen that before. There's also a concept here that you might see in some questions called the base year. A base year is simply a point of reference. It's what you use to compare. So that would be your CPI1 in the formula. And any index value in the base year would be 100. Okay, so we're going to see this base year a little bit later, but overall, if you get questions with the base year, don't freak out, okay? It's not that complicated. So pause here, write this slide number, write a 1-sentence summary for yourself and some highlights of this slide. All right, before talking about the results of inflation, there's an important concept called purchasing power. This is super important, so make sure you take good notes on it. Purchasing power is how much goods and services your money can buy, right? So this is the strength of your money. It's really the same as the value of money. So how much it can do, how much really it's worth for, right? When the prices go up, your purchasing power goes down. And you can see why, because if you have, let's say you have $20 in your pocket, if everything becomes more expensive, your $20 will be less powerful. It's going to have less purchasing power. All right. If you have savings, if you have put aside $1,000, what's going to happen to the purchasing power of your savings when the prices go up? Again, your savings are going to be worthless. And people with fixed incomes also are going to be, oh no, right? So fixed income, some people, their incomes don't adjust based on inflation, right? Some pension plans are like that. So if people have a contract where the income is in dollars, in fixed dollars, that can be dangerous if there is inflation. Now, inflation also creates uncertainty, and that's relevant to incentives for long-term investment. So the incentives are going to be lower. If you're uncertain of future, then you cannot really plan. It makes the confidence of people and businesses go down, right? So inflation has that element, and uncertainty itself is something that we don't like. So overall, it's going to reduce our well-being overall for all the society. Okay, so pause here, record your slide number, 1-sentence summary, and some notes. Make sure you write down purchasing power. Are you allergic to math? If you are, don't worry, I'm going to give you some tips. If you're good in math, well, that's an asset. Either way, this is a short form of the inflation rate. Now notice we have 3 things here. We have the inflation rate, we have price 2, and we have price 1. Okay. In any question, you are given 2 of them, and you're missing the 3rd one, right? So if you want to find the inflation rate, you just plug in the numbers here, it's fine, right? The other 2 types of questions is sometimes the P1 is unknown. Okay, what do you do if P1 is unknown? You're like, oh no, what do you do? Well, it's easy. You just have to cross multiply and move things over. Okay, so you should be able to do this. So those of you who are good in math, try it. Try cross multiplying and moving over. What you would get is this thing. So I'm just simplifying it for you. If you don't know P1, simply you can use this formula. If you don't know P2, what you do again is cross multiply and move over. What you get is this formula. Okay, the only trick here is that you have the inflation rate in decimals. Okay, so you have to convert the percentage to decimals, right? So 5% would be 0.05, for instance. And I boxed this, so I would say write this down, especially those of you who are not good in math and who cannot cross multiply things on your own. This is an easy way for you to solve the problems. And let's do some questions, right? So you have one question about the registration fee, and we have another question about the price of a car. And my tip to you is that you always start by identifying what you know and what you don't know, right? So write down P1, P2, and inflation rate. In each case, there is going to be one of them that you don't know. So you have to identify what is the unknown, and based on the two formula that you have, you should be able to know which one to use and plug in your numbers. Make sure you show all your work. So you start by writing the formula that's applicable, then you plug in the numbers, then you find the answer. As a general rule of thumb, keep up to 2 decimal places, but in this case, if you do the numbers right, there shouldn't be any decimals anyway. So pause here, record the slide number, and do the 2 questions and write down the formulas. Because of inflation, we have to be careful about a fine distinction. So there's this thing called nominal GDP, which is measured in current dollars, where each year using the prices of that year. So, but prices are changing all the time due to inflation, which means that we cannot compare from year to year. So if you remember, you were told that you cannot add apples and oranges, right? What is it really? An apple plus an orange, what is it, right? The only thing that you can say is that, oh, there are 2 fruits or 2 objects. But notice that you're changing your units. They're not 2 apples, they're not 2 oranges. There are 2 objects, or there are 2 fruits. So the idea here, which is really important, is you need to have a common unit. You need to have a common denominator. So just like apples and oranges, you need to convert them into fruits before you can add them. For GDP also, if you want to compare GDP of this year with the GDP of last year, you need to have a common units. The dollars of today are not the same as the dollars of last year because of inflation. Those are just like apples and oranges. You cannot say this year and you compare it to last year, or we add them. You cannot add apples and oranges, okay? So basically, nominal GDP is useless, right? Really, for all practical purposes, it's useless, right? What is a better alternative? It's real GDP. So real GDP is measured in constant dollars. So it's a fixed unit. So prices are fixed at a base year. So if you remember, we showed you the base year. So base year, it could be anywhere. This is arbitrary. You can set this year as base year, or 10 years ago as base year, or whatever. Doesn't matter. The idea is to be consistent. As long as you maintain the prices at the same level, then you have the same unit, then you can add, you can compare. So it reflects the actual level of production, and it's unaffected by inflation. So we don't want GDP to be overinflated because of the prices. We want GDP to focus on the actual level of production, not the prices. Okay, and this way you can compare. Okay, so this would make it more meaningful. All right, so pause here, record this slide number, 1 sentence summary. You might want to watch it again just to recap on what it is, but it's really related to inflation. Nominal GDP reflects changes in both price and quantity, but we don't like that. We just want to focus on quantity. So real GDP focuses only on quantity. All right, so take some notes. All right, so let's recap a little bit. Real GDP is the quantity of all goods and services produced in Canada. And price level is the average price of all goods and services in Canada, which is measured through the CPI. Okay, so really real GDP is the same as quantity, and price level is the same as price. So wow, that's so cool. So basically we can use that to have graphs now, right? So if you remember, we had a graph before, let's say for a corn market, with the quantity and price of corn, right? And the supply and demand of corn. So everything here is about corn, okay? Now what happens is that when you're talking about GDP, GDP is not just corn. GDP is about everything, right? So we are talking about the GDP market instead of the corn market, and instead of the quantity of corn, we're going to talk about real GDP. So it's really the equivalent. The equivalent of quantity is real GDP. And instead of the price of corn, we have the price level, which is the CPI. This is the average price of everything. All right. So this way, instead of supply, we are going to have AS, and I'm going to tell you what the A stands for. And instead of demand, we have AD. Okay. So the graph, the shape of the graph is the same. The dynamics are the same. When you shift the graphs, it's the same rules, right? So all of the rules are the same. The logic is also the same. The only difference is the labels. Okay. So the AD and AS represent aggregate supply and aggregate demand. So aggregate supply is the total supply for all goods and services produced in Canada, and it's based on the cost of production, which is primarily the wage rate or the cost of labor. Okay, so if you remember, wage rate is quite important, and we're going to see it again. AD stands for aggregate demand, and that's the total demand for all goods and services produced in Canada, and that's based on the level of spending in the economy. All right, so really what I want to say here is this is what you've seen before. You've seen supply and demand all the time. We're just applying it for everything. We're just aggregating it, right? So this relates to the AE formula. Remember our good old formula, the C plus I plus whatever. That's the idea that's behind aggregate demand. Okay, so the A in AD and AS stands for aggregate, and aggregate is the same as total. All right. Another thing I want to emphasize is that when we talk about aggregate supply, the main element here is cost. When we talk about aggregate demand, the main element is spending. All right, so those are two important concepts. So when you take notes, you might want to highlight these concepts. So pause here, record the slide number, draw a diagram for yourself with the proper labeling for AD and AS, and write a one-sentence summary of what you learned from this slide and some other notes, including some of the things that I underlined. Okay, I'm so excited. This is a super useful slide, and you're gonna love it. Some of you are like, oh no, this course is getting so difficult. I'm gonna dumb it down for you. We're gonna have a simple analogy of how the economy works. So think of a bakery. What does a bakery make? Bread and pastries, right? And what do they use? What are their inputs? The ingredients, right? So like flour or eggs or oil, and let's say dough, right? And this dough includes also electricity and rent and workers, right? So all of that. So anything that goes into it, we just call it dough. So all of that is input, and the bread is the output. Right? So input is what goes into the bakery, and output is what comes out of it. Duh! Right? Now this simple representation, this is really how the economy works. That's all there is to it, right? The bakery is our economy, and the output is the same as GDP, real GDP, right? If you don't like the word GDP, if that, if you lose your balance on it, fine, just call it bread. That's fine. Call it bread, really. And the input is the same as our resources, and especially labor. That's really the major resource that we're sensitive about. So if you don't like labor, or if you don't like wage rate and things like that, just call it dough and the price of dough or flour. Okay, that would be fine. So this is the picture that I want you to have with you, because it really helps you. So if wages go up, it's kind of like the price of dough going up. Now, if you're a bakery, do you like to have to pay more for dough or less for dough? You're buying dough, you're using dough to make bread, right? That means more cost for you. So the level of production would go down. Your bread production is going to decrease, all right? Because employers can't hire as many workers as before. You cannot buy as much dough as before, okay? And that means the aggregate supply curve is going to shift to the left. Exactly the same format as you had with regular supply. All right. If the labor market is more flexible and competitive, then it means that it's easier to find stuff. So the aggregate supply is going to increase and shift to the right. So the GDP is going to increase, and more GDP means more employment, because it means you are using more resources, using more labor, and that means higher standard of living, right? So remember, the resources include includes all of the resources, all the 4 resources. So you might want to review that as a good reminder. What I would say is you have to pause here and record this slide number. Make sure you draw a bakery example for yourself. Okay, that really helps the material to stick with you. And from now on, if you don't like the GDP terminology, you can use bread. That's fine with me. What I care about is your understanding, okay? Basically, the idea of supply here is anything that makes production more costly or less costly. That's what affects the supply curve. And when it comes to the shifts, it's very simple, just right and left like before. Okay, so write a one-sentence summary for this slide, and also do a little picture for yourself and take good notes. Time for practice. So we're gonna have a GDP market, and whenever you have a question, oh, that's so cool. Whenever you have a question like this, you always start with a graph like what you see here. everything is exactly like this. This is your starting point. You have ADAS, equilibrium, and make sure you have all of the labels. Remember that the Y symbol stands for GDP. That's just a short form for national income. So we're going to look at an event, which is the workers go on strike for higher pay. Now think about what's going to happen. If you're the baker, would you like your owners, your workers to go on strike or not? What happens to the bread production of the bakery if the workers go on strike, right? So the idea here is that the cost of production is higher. They're demanding more pay. It's harder to find workers. So the aggregate supply is going to decrease, and whenever it decreases, you shift it to the left because the firms can hire fewer workers than before, right? So what you do is you draw, just like before, draw arrows to the left, draw new AS2, okay, so write 1 and 2 just to distinguish, and you get a new equilibrium, right? So that would be P2 and Y2. Now what you have to do is you have to compare your P1, P2 and Y1, Y2. Okay, so you can see that the P is increasing and the Y is decreasing, right? So you have to write that down as a conclusion that the equilibrium price level is going to increase. That would be an inflation, and equilibrium GDP is going to decrease. All right, so this is how you would do questions on GDP market. So another example for you is, let's say the minimum wage is revoked, and revoked is the same as removed. Okay, so you have to write down what is the effect of that. You have to show it in the graph, and you have to conclude what happens to the equilibrium price and equilibrium GDP. So take your time, copy down the two diagrams, do the example that I show you to have it in your notes, and also do the other example, which is your homework. Make sure you do a good, neat job with the graph, and you write your explanation in your own words using your own logic. Wow, that was cool. All right, aggregate demand shifters. So the source of aggregate demand is the level of spending. That's what fuels demand. All right, now there is a little difference. Some of you might be like, hang on, what's the difference between aggregate demand and aggregate expenditure? They're related, they're not the same. Basically, the idea is that spending fuels demand. All right, so spending is the cause of more demand. Anyway, what it means for us is that whenever we are dealing with demand, we have to remember our formula, the aggregate expenditure formula. If any of these 5 items, the C, I, G, X, M, if any of these things changes, then that's going to affect the demand. So we're going to look at them one by one, starting with consumption. The first element that affects the consumption of people is the interest rate. Right, interest rate is super important. We use R for the symbol of that. Sometimes you might see I as a symbol, both of them are used. Anyway, what's important about the interest rate is that it affects 2 groups of people, right? One of them are the borrowers, and then one of them are the lenders or the savers. And it affects them in 2 opposite ways, right? So the interest rate is going to affect the incentive of the borrowers to borrow and the incentive of the savers to save. Okay, so this word incentive is super important, as you have noticed so far. If you want to be a good economist, you have to always question the incentives involved in every event. So what happens if the interest rate goes up? Think of borrowers. If you're a borrower, would you like the interest rate to be up or down? The interest rate is a cost for a borrower, right? So they wouldn't be happy, right? They're going to be, oh no, what's going on, right? So if the interest rate goes up, the borrowers have less incentive to borrow, so they're going to borrow less. Yeah. Now, if you remember, we had something called durable goods, like non-American cars. Yeah. So, and those are usually bought on credit, and credit means a loan. So you have to pay interest on it. So if people borrow less, it means they're going to buy less of those durable goods. So consumption goes down. Think of savers. If you're a saver, if you have extra money, what happens to your incentive? Would people have incentive to save more or save less when the interest rate is higher? Now the savers earn interest, right? So it is a positive incentive for them. So they would be like, yay. So they would have incentive to save more, and if they use money to save, then it means that they are not spending, right? So the consumption goes down either way, right? So the interest rate either way affects the consumption by lowering it. Okay, pause here, write a 1-sentence summary for this slide in your own words and some notes. Another factor that affects consumption is confidence or future expectations. This is a psychological element. It's about the optimism of people. right? And here you have to think about savings. Remember, savings is about security, about future security, right? Now, here's the thing. Think about a situation where people are optimistic about their future, or a person is optimistic, right? Now, we're talking about not just the person, but the whole society. If there's an overall spirit of optimism, if people are confident about their future, what's going to happen to their spending? They're going to spend more, right? Why? Because there's not much need to save. People are secure. On the other hand, what if people are insecure? What if they are afraid? If they feel threatened for whatever reason? It would be the opposite, right? So here we have to remember our formula for disposable income. Remember, disposable income is your income after taxes. You use it either to consume or save. If one of them goes up, the other one goes down. So if future employment is uncertain and people are afraid of being laid off means being fired, what happens is that they're gonna save up just in case, right? So that means they're gonna spend less. The next element in our AE formula is investment, or I. Again, the first factor is interest rate. So interest rate affects both consumption and investment. Interest rate is the opportunity cost of borrowing, it's the opportunity cost of investment. So I really emphasize this because it's super important, the idea that whenever you have interest rate, remember borrowing, and whenever you have investment, also remember borrowing. That's the connecting link between investment and interest rate. Now, if the interest rate goes up, investment goes down because it costs more to borrow. So remember, firms are borrowers, investment means borrowing. So if the interest rate is higher, it means a higher cost of borrowing. Another factor that affects investment, again, is confidence. This time, it's business confidence. So we have consumer confidence and business confidence. Either way, it's the same way. It's the same thing. It affects the economy in the same manner. So if the companies are optimistic about their future, they would invest more today because it pays off in the future, right? So again, the idea is they're gonna put more money into their business. So pause here, record the slide number, and write some notes in your own words. The next element in our formula is G, government purchases, but we're gonna leave that for later when we do fiscal policy. So we're gonna move on to exports and imports and talk about them together. So the first element that affects the exports and imports is Canadian dollar, right? So the value of the Canadian dollar. So let's say our dollar becomes stronger. What does it mean? Our dollar is stronger compared to other currencies, right? So you have to think about exports and imports. So first of all, let's look at imports. Imports is when we buy from others, right? So if dollar is stronger, are we gonna buy more or less from other countries? Yeah, so we can buy more because our dollar is stronger. So that's also called the loonie. So the loonie is the bird, and it's the bird that shows up on the dollar coin. That's what's called the loonie. So if you see it in the news, loonie simply means the Canadian dollar. So our imports would go up. What about our exports? Exports is when others buy from us. So if other countries, is it going to be easier or more costly for them to buy from us if our dollar is stronger? It's going to be the exact opposite of imports, right? So our goods are going to be more expensive to them to buy, so our exports will go down, right? So all of your wonderful maple syrup is going to have less buyers now. What a miss. All right, so let's look at an example. Suppose we import $80 and exports $120, and you can think of that in millions if you like, doesn't matter. So you would have to find the difference between exports and imports, and if you remember, that is called net exports, okay? Then the loonie appreciates, which is to say it becomes stronger, and our imports rise to 90 and our exports fall to 110. Then what happens to our net exports? Okay, so take a minute. I don't think you need to punch it in because the numbers are so simple. You can do it in your head and find the values. Okay, if you find the values, now notice here, initially the imports are 80, then they become 90, so the imports are going up. Yeah, the exports are 120, then they fall to 110, so they're going down, right? Now you might be like, oh no, this is confusing. One is up, one is down. Are they going to cancel out? And the reason is no, they're not going to cancel out because there is a negative here, right? So this negative makes this up turn into a down. So the two both together will reduce. And if you have any doubts, just plug in the numbers. Do the numbers and you're going to see the net exports will actually go down. You just have to find how much they go down, okay? When we do the graphs, it's the same rule as before. An increase means a shift to the right. A decrease means a shift to the left. Okay, so before we do some practice, pause here, record the slide number, write a one-sentence summary, and some notes. Wow, that was cool. All right, time for practice. So we're gonna have a GDP market with ADAS equilibrium and the dotted line showing the price and quantity. And we're gonna have an event, which is the interest rate going up. We wanna see what happens to our economy if the interest rate goes up, right? Now, in these questions, you need to know your shifters. So you have to look at your notes and see where you find interest rate. So the first question to ask is it related to the supply side or demand side, right? If you remember, the supply side was pretty much just about the wage rate. Interest rate was more on the demand side with consumption and investment, okay? So interest rate is the cost of borrowing, which is going up, which means if borrowing is more expensive, people are going to borrow less, so they're going to consume less and they're going to invest less. So the households and firms are affected here. Also, whenever you have the consumption or investment or any of the elements on the demand side, you have to write your formula. So you always get marks for writing your formula because this shows your thinking process that you are doing these steps correctly. So if the consumption and investment go down, then aggregate expenditure would go down. And as a result of that, there's going to be less demand. So you would shift your demand curve to the left. So draw arrows toward the left, draw a new demand curve and call it 82. And you get a new equilibrium with P2 and Y2. So compare P1 to P2, you see the arrow is going down, and Y1 to Y2 is also going down. So the equilibrium price level falls, and equilibrium GDP also falls. This is how you should do questions if you get them in a test. Notice that everything is labeled properly, and you have the dotted lines and the arrows. So everything you have to show so that it is clear that the steps are there. All right, also notice that you have to explain your logic. So the logic here is that we're talking about the cost of borrowing, right? Another example for you to do is what happens if the Canadian dollar becomes weaker. Okay, so again, you have to look at your shifters, which one is affected and how, right? So you have to tell me the effect on that and the reasoning. You write your formula and you decide what happens to AD. This is an AD shifter. And what happens to the equilibrium price and equilibrium GDP, right? So you have to do it on your own, and you have to do the shift on the curves as you see in the example. Okay, so pause here for a minute, do the example, make sure you do. So first of all, copy the example that I gave you, and copy the other example where you have to do it. Use a ruler, use your hands, do a neat job. If you want to color code it, it's not a bad idea. And again, make sure everything is complete. Since practice makes perfect, let's do a couple more. In one case, there's fear of a nuclear world war. In the other case, there's interest rates going down. So what you have to do is show the graph with all the arrows and all the labeling, and also show your reasoning. So you should have the formula, remember, and the reason why it happens and which curve shifts, and also what happens to the equilibrium levels, just as we did before. So take your time and do these examples. Today we talked about the aggregate demand and the aggregate supply. Their interaction will give us the equilibrium real GDP and the price level. The main driving force of aggregate demand is aggregate expenditure, which is primarily determined by the interest rate and the confidence of people and firms. Aggregate supply is determined by the production costs, and a main example of that is the wages. The price level is measured through the CPI. If it goes up, we call it inflation, which is going to reduce the level of confidence and raise the wages. The concepts I would emphasize here are the interest rate and the confidence level on the demand side, and the wages on the supply side. So pause here, do a nice concept map for yourself. If you want to use the version that I have, you have to make at least 2 major changes, and major change means either adding something new to it or changing the shape or some other form. Remember, by just copying down, you don't learn. You have to develop your own way of representation. Back to the start. If the interest rate is lowered, what do you expect? So take a few minutes, re-answer the questions, at least 2 points for each, and it should show some progress in your thinking. A sample student answer in a test, which I think is fairly advanced, is in terms of incentives, it's easier to borrow, and there's also an element of impulsiveness or impatience. Remember that we are talking about the dichotomy between saving and consumption. and that is what's being sacrificed. So savings would go down and future consumption would also go down because that comes from savings. Possible alternatives, well, you could induce saving or you could delay gratification. Okay, so those are possible answers. Okay, again, these are ideas that you can draw on, but you have to develop your own eventually, and you have to use your own words. So have a wonderful day.